Thank you, Kim, and thank you so much, Andrew. Of course, it takes an economist to introduce Shakespeare into a conference, so this is a great testament, again, to the interdisciplinary reach of Andrew's expertise, but also the interdisciplinary nature of this conference. Well, as the convener of this conference, I'm delighted to see representatives from many parts of the world where critical research on violence perpetrated and condoned in the name of honor occurs. In English, the word honor has an archaic and formulaic ring, but its association with interpersonal acts of violence, from threats and intimidation to murder, is worryingly present. When I began to plan for this conference about a year ago, some colleagues thought that I had moved into a new field of study. Much of my research on violence and homicide has focused on the 19th century and on Canada, the US, and Australia. However, as a criminal justice and gender historian, what struck me about contemporary honor-based violence reportage was the ahistorical and exotic lens placed over such crimes whenever the individuals involved were Muslims, Hindus, or individuals from regions outside the affluent industrial nations. Yet, in my analysis of hundreds of homicide cases, I have uncovered numerous instances in which perpetrators' perceptions of personal shame and lost honor, individual and familial, propelled them toward violence. In Anglo-European cultures, dueling is the most obvious extra-legal practice through which honor has been avenged and defended, often to the death. But even outside of such rituals and cults, intense feelings of lost honor in business dealings, in romantic relations, in political life, have burst into violence, which in some contexts, including ancient Rome, colonial Australia, Victorian Britain, and Italy until the very recent past, each of which we'll hear about today, has been sanctioned through judicial processes and endorsed by clans and communities. What are the implications of speaking about acts such as these in the same context in which we address so-called honor killing? Does the placement of quotation marks around honor accomplish the adjective's interrogation? As Lama Abu Odeh has argued, we need to disturb the racist dichotomy in which we regard crimes of passion in the West versus the East's and the demonized others' crimes of honor. After all, in countries whose legal systems are based on common law as well as Roman law, both statutes and case law have, until very recently, regarded the defense of honor as a mitigating rather than an aggravating factor. The result in both cases is controlling violence and, at the extreme, murder. But is this outcome reached through the same cultural roots? And can we project that the strategies developed to combat extra-legal honor-based violence be adopted in current-day efforts to criminalize honor killing? Another issue that the papers presented over the next 2 days will address is the tendency to understand what is typically termed domestic or family violence as a matter of individual psychopathology, in contrast to honor killing as the enactment of a cultural script. What are the unacknowledged cultural underpinnings of domestic violence? And what are the under-recognized psychological dimensions of honor-associated violence? As we have discussed already, the terms we use in posing questions of this nature are freighted and require unpacking. So, for example, to speak alternatively of femicide, do we obscure the intragender components of violence predicated on honor's defense and leave male victims along with female perpetrators and instigators in the analytical shadows? Several papers today and tomorrow will address these questions. We're all familiar with the disgust and condemnation that characterizes mainstream media accounts of honor killing and outrage against the reluctance of authorities to recognize the illegitimacy of violence. This outrage has provided momentum for international lobbying in favor of the prosecution of crimes and the punishment of perpetrators. At the same time, such responses imply that the only critics of honor killing are outsiders, an assumption that can reinforce exoticized readings of backward cultures and rigidify resistance when the prospect of change can be labeled Western interference and cultural intolerance. Yet the conference papers will highlight what we don't see in sensationalized reports. That is, women and men speaking out, working to change culture from within. How then can human rights advocates and host nations working with immigrant communities work with, rather than on, cultural groups in which women are especially vulnerable to honor-justified violence? These are the questions that presenters will address over the next 2 days. This is a conference about crime and about unjust victimization, but it is not a law conference. This is a gathering that discusses the transhistorical and multicultural dimensions of honor, but it is not a history or anthropology congress. Although activists seeking to reduce the frequency of honor killings through human rights advocacy and legal reform rely on law as an instrument of change and as a benchmark of progress, it is clear from historical and ethnographic research that legal tactics such as criminalization play a confined role in shifting culture. As we saw last night in Nilofer Farouk's talk about her extraordinary curated exhibition, No Honor in Killing, art and other forms of cultural engagement can create openings for interaction on sensitive issues, highlighting the dishonorable practices that are cloaked in claims of honor. It is through dialogue that we, men as well as women, can begin to imagine new ways to align honor with the naming of violence and its condemnation. Questions, naturally, are easier to ask than to answer. So this is why I have selected papers from scholars and activists and scholar activists who will attempt to provide insights drawn from their archival and ethnographic research, their legal and political activism, their critical analyses of popular media, their oral histories, and participant observation. It's doubtful that we will reach agreement on every issue raised, but I do anticipate that we will find ways to exchange ideas, especially where we differ. This is why I have chosen to have one stream of papers, which allows us the opportunity to be challenged and stimulated by every presentation, and to make connections between the papers. I have also allowed ample room between sessions to permit presenters and members of the audience to mingle and speak informally. As we all recognize, words can be weapons and can become twisted, particularly when we address controversial issues. And this observation takes me to the image I've selected to advertise the conference, the one that appears behind me. It's an acrylic on canvas by Simin Farhat, one of the artists who contributed to Nilofer's traveling exhibition and who I'm happy to say led me to Nilofer. Much of Simin's work turns on words and turns words into art. In this case, some words from Faiz Ahmed Faiz, We Who Were Executed. Just as words can lead to violence, they can also unfurl in novel ways, assuming unforeseen shapes and newly imagined ways of thinking, which is precisely what I hope for this conference. Thank you.